105k, okay, disgusting. 105k, okay. Okay. He hit the pillar. Yo, we're gaming. Where are my crits? Oh, there we go. Ganyu is currently one of the strongest DPS characters in the entire game and has been since her initial release last year. So if you just had her in your character list or if you rolled her on her rerun, congratulations and welcome to my guide. This is probably one of the most in-depth videos I've made, mostly because there are so many nuances to Ganyu that I wanted to make sure that I covered them all, since I know that a lot of content creators aren't going to be talking about them. So in this video, I'm going to be extremely detailed, but every section of this video that's long is extended only because I've been playing Ganyu for over a year and there are so many important things to talk about with their playstyles and builds. So if you really want to be a Ganyu expert, I highly suggest you watch the entire thing, but if you're just interested in certain sections, there will be timestamps in the description. With all of that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about the Coco greatest of all time. So first off, I want to talk about her kit and then I want to talk about her playstyles. So the main thing that Ganyu is held in high regard for are her charged attacks. They have absurdly high scaling and her charge shot has 2 levels to it. You're basically going to always want to charge your shot to the second level because it hits twice and both parts of the shot deal damage, but the second part of it deals more damage than the first part and it deals area wide damage, meaning if there's other enemies in the vicinity, they can also be hit by your charge shot. Now, when you use a cryo attack on an enemy with pyro applied to them, you'll do a reverse melt which multiplies your damage. And this is super important for Ganyu because when you use her level 2 charge shot, both hits can actually melt, which makes her damage dealing super high. This is called a double melt and it's the bread and butter of melt Ganyu. Now there are 2 ways to aim shot. One is by holding an aim button and the other is by toggling it on and off. This is kind of an advanced tech, but if you use the hold to aim option, you can actually shoot faster than if you use the toggle aim. The reason for this is because there's an animation at the end of Ganyu's charge shot that stops you from charging your next arrow if you're using the toggle aim. So basically, if you want to take full advantage of Ganyu, I would suggest that you use hold aim shot over toggle because you'll get more damage out over time. Now the one last thing that I want to say about her charge shots is that her first ascension passive increases their effective crit rate by 20% for 5 seconds after you shoot the first arrow. So this basically just means that you don't need to build above 50 or 60 crit rate for melt Ganyu and even less for freeze because she's going to be able to crit more consistently than her actual stat crit rate shows. As far as her elemental skill, when you use her skill, she dashes backwards and places a taunt that's based off her HP. It does a quick hit of cryo damage that applies cryo and it explodes for more damage when it's either destroyed or when its 6-second timer is up. Her skill is amazing for freeze teams and has a short 10-second cooldown, generates 2 particles on the initial hit and 2 particles on the explosion. Now Ganyu's elemental burst is also insane. It drops 50 icicles in a large radius, but it is worth noting that only a portion of them actually track enemies. Each one's going to do a small AoE of cryo damage. It doesn't look like it's an AoE, but it can hit multiple enemies, and it is also worth noting that only 1 in 3 hits will apply cryo to enemies. This is just due to her default internal cooldown. Just like other characters who have to hit 3 times to apply an element again, she does as well. As an example of their area of effect, if you group enemies with Venti, the icicles can hit multiple enemies and increase Ganyu's damage significantly. And since the icicles track, you're going to be dropping more icicles in one concentrated area as well. Her burst can also snapshot buffs, so if you use Prototype Crescent for example, you can activate its ability to give you an attack buff by hitting a weak point and then use Ganyu's burst to make sure it keeps the attack bonus for the full duration. It lasts for 15 seconds, but the cooldown is also 15 seconds. So if you combine that with her animation, you can have her burst up nearly 100% of the time. Now Ganyu's second ascension passive actually buffs her elemental burst by a lot. It grants a 20% cryo damage bonus to active party members in the AoE of her elemental burst. This basically just means that when you use Ganyu's burst, you want to make sure you're standing inside of it, so that way you get a 20% cryo damage bonus. It is actually a big difference in damage. So as far as talent priority, if you're going to be building her as a DPS, you want to level up her charged attacks first, then her burst, and then her skill. But if you're building her as a support, which we'll talk about later in the video, you're going to level up her burst and then her skill and then her charged attacks. So as mentioned before, I want to talk about Ganyu's playstyles. There's essentially 3 playstyles for Ganyu that are relevant, with 2 of them being meta. The first style is Melt, which takes advantage of Ganyu's charge shots being able to melt both parts. With a character that applies Pyro fast enough like Pyro-infused Kazuha or Xiangling, Ganyu can output massive damage that'll carry you through any Spiral Abyss floor that doesn't resist Cryo. The second playstyle is going to be Freeze, which works well with Ganyu because she has so much Cryo available in her kit. The main idea is that if enemies are frozen, they can't really fight back. And there are plenty of characters that buff buff freeze teams and cryo damage, which Ganyu is actually one of with her Ascension passive that increases cryo damage in her burst radius. Now the third playstyle is less popular and honestly less effective, but a lot of people still play it, and that is the support playstyle, where Ganyu can fully utilize her 100% uptime burst to constantly output cryo damage and create reactions. Now, as someone who's played Ganyu for over a year and has done extensive research on this, I really don't recommend building her as a support because she is a top damaging unit, and by building her as a support, you're lowering her overall potential. That being said, we'll also still be covering a support build in this video. Now, before we get into artifact builds, I want to talk about Ganyu's best weapons. Now, I tried not to include every single weapon in this because I knew it would just be too long, but I didn't really want to leave anything out either, so I ended up just talking about most of the weapons in the game. Anyways, let's just get into it. So, Amos' bow is her signature weapon. The reason it's best in slot for her is because not only does it have crazy high stats, but its effect that increases charged attack damage also applies to the second hit of her charge shot. Her arrow bloom animation takes a minimum of 0.3 seconds to animate, which means that even at point blank range, Amos' bow is getting at least 24% extra damage bonus from its passive. It's amazing for Ganyu, but before you pull, just listen to the rest of the weapons. So next up is Thundering Pulse. It's an awesome stat stick that ends up being consistently good across different Ganyu teams. This means Melt, Freeze, and literally anything else Thundering Pulse is going to be good on just because it has good stats. Now, Polar Star is also really good since you can get a stack by using one normal attack before starting to hit your charge shots easily, and the stack will increase your overall damage output. Outside of that, its stats are also just really good. If you're free to play or just don't have any 5-star bows though, the good news is that Prototype Crescent at Refinement 5 is almost as good as Amos' bow because its ability gives 72% attack after hitting a weak spot, which means that as long as you can aim and the enemies have a head, you'll constantly have ridiculously high attack. It's also universally good in Freeze and Melt, so overall if you do have any of the materials to craft Prototype Crescent, I would highly recommend that weapon. That being said, there is another craftable I want to talk about in just a second. Before we get to that though, Skyward Harp is also a great stat stick because it gives crit value, but if you can get decent crit substats on your artifacts, then Prototype Crescent at Refinement 5 is still gonna be better. Black Cliff is also really solid too because of the crit damage main stat and because of its pretty underrated passive. Its passive gives 12% attack for 30 seconds up to 3 times whenever you kill an enemy at Refinement 1. And what makes Ganyu good for this is that she already stays on the field for a decent chunk of time, and she's one of, if not the best group clear character in the game since her arrow bloom does so much damage. So as long as you're not constantly fighting boss enemies, getting stacks on Black Cliff is super quick and easy. Now, Hamayumi is the other craftable bow that you may want to build for Ganyu, and while it's extremely good in Melt, I do want to caution you that it's significantly less strong in Freeze. The main reason is its passive ability that activates only when you have full energy. In Melt Ganyu, you don't want to use Ganyu's burst at all because it'll take away some of her melts from charge shots, but in Freeze Ganyu, you want to use her burst often to keep applying cryo and dealing extra damage. In Freeze, you'll almost never be doing charge shots with her energy at 100%, so Hamayumi falls off pretty hard. Hamayumi R5 does end up being slightly better than Prototype Crescent at R5 for Melt, but not for Freeze, and on top of that, Hamayumi doesn't work with Shimenawa super well since Hamayumi wants full energy, but Shimenawa takes away energy. Overall, despite some of the newer enemies not having weak points, I still think Prototype Crescent is the safer bet over Hamayumi for its flexibility. So between the two craftables, I would choose Prototype Crescent. And don't worry, even though I'm talking about them at R5, they're still very, very good at R1. You'll just want to get them R1 and try to get them to R5 as you progress in the game. Lastly, Viridescent Hunt is fine for stats, but generally speaking, all of the bows I listed are going to be better. Now, really quickly, before we move on to artifacts, I do want to talk about support Ganyu bows because a lot of content creators are going to skip this part, so I want to at least make sure you guys get the right information from somewhere. So for support Ganyu, you can basically use any DPS weapon if you have high energy recharge substats. Elegy is going to be your best support pick since it gives your team attack and elemental mastery off of her burst and skill hits. But outside of that, Favonius works if you can aim since you can force a critical hit to get the proc, and Sacrificial Bow is okay too. I do have an issue with Sacrificial Bow though. It's kind of a nitpick, but if you use her skill twice in a row, you dash back really far and it can be kind of annoying to recenter yourself to use your burst afterwards. Lastly, Stringless is okay too for support Ganyu because of its passive that increases skill and burst damage, but the EM stat on her will be pretty useless. Now, the newer one, it's kind of copium. You can see bigger burst damage on it in expensive burst teams, so if that's what you're looking for, it's solid, but it's just not really flexible for many other characters or for using it with other Ganyu playstyles, so I don't recommend leveling it, but it can work. As for the 3-star bows, I wouldn't suggest leveling one at all. You can guarantee at least one bow prototype from the Geo Sigil shop in Liyue, so I would highly suggest if you're a newer player or if you're looking to craft a bow that you go get that prototype craftable item and use that to craft a bow. So now we're getting to the meat of the video, which is going to be talking about artifacts. It's important to know that for most of these artifact setups, substats will be more important than sets comparatively. What I mean is that if you have a Shimenawa set with bad stats, but a Wanderer's Troop set with good stats, the Wanderer's Troop set may actually end up dealing more damage than the Shimenawa one. With that being said though, let's get into builds. The first build we're going to talk about is a reverse melt build. For reverse melt, I have 3 artifact sets we're going to recommend. So the first one is going to be 4-piece Shimenawa. Now if you do watch my streams over at twitch.tv/Braxophone, come stop by to put a couple wrinkles on your brain, you'll know that I hate the Shimenawa set. I think that the Shimenawa set was incredibly poorly designed and it shouldn't be in the game. But with that being said, it does work with Melt Ganyu. If you remember earlier, we talked about how you don't actually use her burst at all when you're using her in a melt team, which means as a result of that, you're always going to have a full or close to full energy bank, and you can actually use her elemental skill to activate Shimenawa and it's not going to be an energy problem. I mentioned this earlier as well, but normal and charged attack bonus applies for both the first half and the second half of Ganyu charged attacks, so it ends up being very strong. On paper, 4-piece Shimenawa is going to be the strongest one for Melt Ganyu, and it's pretty resin efficient because every character and their mom wants Emblem of Severed Fate, so it's a really solid option. But if you don't have 4-piece Shimenawa, you have 2 other options as well. One of them is Wanderer's Troop, which is actually the set that I'm using right now. It gives you 80 elemental mastery with a 2-piece set, but the 4-piece set gives you 35% charged attack damage, which again applies to both your normal and charged attacks. Overall, this set buffs your reaction damage and gives you the 35% charged shot damage buff. Now again, Shimenawa is going to be slightly stronger, but if you have better substats on your Wanderer's Troop than you do on Shimenawa, then Wanderers may actually be better. It just depends on your crit, how often you're critting, your elemental mastery, your attack substats, all of that stuff. Between the two, just pick whichever ones work best for you. The third one that I want to talk about is Retracing Bolide, and this is going to be a set that increases your normal and charged attack damage by 40% when you're shielded. Now the reason I like this set, and a lot of people actually don't really like this set because Shimenawa exists, but the reason that I like it is because it increases your shield strength, which is actually a big comfort of play thing. Now theory crafters don't really take into account comfort of play, I find, on most things, which is why Retracing Bolide gets dismissed a lot, but 35% more shield strength in combination with 40% more charged attack damage is huge for Ganyu, especially if you're not using Zhongli. That shield bonus is going to help a lot. So if you have a 4-piece Retracing Bolide set, this can work very well on Ganyu, and I would suggest using it if you don't have access to Wanderer's Troop or Shimenawa. Now the artifact main stats may surprise you. When you're playing a melt team, you'll find that you're basically always playing Ganyu with Bennett, because Bennett gives a lot of attack, and because Ganyu's base attack is already pretty high, you actually gain significantly more damage in melt with an elemental mastery sans than an attack sans. So on screen now is a comparison of attack sans melt versus elemental mastery sans melt, and as you can see, elemental mastery sans is a lot stronger. Now that doesn't mean that attack sans is bad, because you still get a lot of damage unconditionally, but to be honest, Ganyu's damage even with an elemental mastery sans and without Bennett is still really high. So at high investment to max your damage, you're going to want elemental mastery sans, cryo damage, and crit on your circlet. Again, you can use attack sans, but in melt, elemental mastery is going to be better. For substats, you're going to want crit rate and damage, elemental mastery, and attack percent. Next up, we're going to be talking about Freeze Ganyu, and this one's actually a lot more straightforward. So for freeze teams, I highly suggest 4-piece Blizzard Strayer because it's going to give you 40% effective crit rate whenever you're hitting a frozen enemy. Having a 40% default crit rate is actually insane. It lets you funnel all of your stats into crit damage because you're not going to have to worry about crit rate at all. Especially coupled with her Ascension 1 passive that gives her 20% crit rate on her charge shots, and Cryo Resonance, you're not going to have a lot of crit rate to worry about. And also the 2-piece gives you 15% cryo damage bonus, which is just pretty nice. Blizzard Strayer can actually be pretty resin efficient as well if you're farming for Syncchaw, if you're farming for Child, anyone who can use 2 or 4-piece Heart of the Depths, you can kind of knock out both at the same time here, so it's really nice. Another option you have is 4-piece Wanderer's Troop for 35% charged attack damage that applies to both parts of Ganyu's shots, or 2-piece Shimenawa 2-piece Blizzard Strayer. Technically speaking, on paper, Wanderer's Troop and the 2-2 set I just listed will net you more damage than Blizzard Strayer, but realistically, getting a free 40% crit rate ends up making the character much easier to play, build, and hit the damage ceiling with. Lastly, on freeze, you don't really want to run Shimenawa or Bolide. The reason for Shimenawa is because with Ganyu in a freeze team, you basically want to be spamming or burst whenever it's up, but Ganyu doesn't have enough particle generation to give you 15 energy back quickly. So if you do run Shimenawa, you won't be able to use her burst and get the 50% normal and charged attack bonus consistently. It's something you can do, but it's pretty copium. As for Retracing Bolide, you just don't really need a shield in permafreeze teams, and you can replace a shield character with another DPS or support to increase your team's damage output, so Bolide's effect can be really hard to take advantage of. For main stats, it's actually really simple. You just want to run attack percent sans, cryo damage goblet, and probably a crit damage circlet, but you can use crit rate if you need it. If you're not using Blizzard Strayer, crit rate can be viable, but most of the time you're going to want crit damage and freeze. And for substats, you want to prioritize crit rate and damage, attack percent, and energy recharge. Now moving on to the final build I have for you guys, this is going to be a support build for Ganyu, and there's a couple options for it. It's just going to be mostly broken sets. So you can use basically any combination of 2 pieces from Noblesse, Emblem of Severed Severed Fate or Blizzard Strayer. For support Ganyu, you want to get to somewhere between 130 and 160 energy recharge, which is something you can get with just a weapon, just an energy recharge sands, or just substats. Now you may find that you don't need to use Emblem to get to that amount of energy recharge at all, in which case building Noblesse and Blizzard Strayer will net you the most damage. 4-piece Noblesse is also a solid option for buffing your team, but only use Noblesse if your team doesn't have a character using Noblesse already. Now the reason I'm not recommending Emblem of Severed Fate is because at a low energy recharge like this, your burst damage increase isn't so noticeable that you'd need to farm a full 4-piece set, and on top of that, Emblem of Severed Fate won't buff your elemental skill or your charged attacks. That being said, though, 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate can work, and if you already have a set lying around, then that could be perfect. But yeah, Ganyu support just doesn't really need to have super min-max stuff. You can use any of those broken sets, you can use 4 Emblem, you can use 4 Noblesse. Honestly, all of them are going to be fine. For stats, you only need an energy recharge sands if you're not using an energy recharge weapon and don't have ER substats. I would highly recommend keeping an attack sands on her for support, since her burst can be a massive source of damage. Really would not recommend ER sands unless you absolutely need it. But outside of that, use a cryo damage cup and a crit circlet. For substats, prioritize energy recharge to a minimum of 130%, and then crit rate and crit damage and attack percent. Now just real quickly, it is worth noting that depending on the content you're in, you may need more or less energy recharge. The 130 to 160 is just kind of a general use calculation based off of energy particles and her total cost of burst, but 130 to 160 will be the sweet spot. I like to have about 130 at most, but you guys may need more or less. So now we're going to quickly talk about Ganyu teams, and Ganyu teams actually have a little bit of flexibility. She's not the most flexible character in the game, but no matter who you put her with, she's still going to do a lot of damage. So the first team that I want to talk about is a Melt team. Melt is my favorite Ganyu comp because it gives you big charge shot numbers that make your monkey brain release the feel-good chemicals, and Bennett is basically a must-have in this team with every combination. He'll buff your team, apply pyro to enemies, and compensate for Ganyu's lost attack with elemental mastery sands. Now you can use Bennett Xiangling, which is the most free-to-play friendly combo, Bennett and Jean, which is harder to play but it still works, or Bennett and Kazuha to swirl pyro. I like using Bennett and Xiangling since Xiangling can snapshot Bennett's buff, so even when Ganyu is on the field, Xiangling's burst is still doing extra damage. That and Xiangling is just kind of broken. Now generally speaking, you'll want a shielder if you don't want to put much thought into your gameplay. The shielder doesn't have to be Zhongli though. They can be a C4 Yanfei with Thrilling Tales, they can be Diona, or they can be Noelle. Diona only works if you don't use her burst though, since that can steal some melts. So if you are playing Diona for shield, you basically only have to use her shield, otherwise you'll ruin some of your damage output. Another variant of this that I would use if I didn't lose my Kazuha 50-50 is with Bennett, Xiangling, and Kazuha instead of a shielder, since Kazuha can debuff cryo and pyro to make both Xiangling and Ganyu stronger. Now the one issue with Kazuha is that you have to be patient and good at dodging, otherwise you're going to get one punch to Celestia. Same rule applies to Shona. She's strong in Melt Ganyu for amplifying her damage, so if you can dodge well, she's an amazing option, but otherwise I'd stick with a shielder. Another team option you have for Ganyu is Morgana. Mo for Mona, Ga for Ganyu, Na for Diona, and the R is for Relevant, which is what League players seem to think their game is. Morgana is about utilizing Mona's Omen freeze technique, which is basically when you apply cryo to an enemy and then use Mona's burst to apply her debuff. For those of you who don't know, Mona's burst makes it so that you deal more damage to enemies. It's basically a big debuff, and when the bubble is gone and popped, you have about 5 seconds to deal as much damage as you can before the debuff goes away. But as long as an enemy is frozen with the Omen itself, the Omen debuff can be extended to last around 12 to 13 seconds, around 8 from the bubble and 5 from the pop. With Morgana, you can also take advantage of Ganyu's burst icicles hitting multiple enemies at the same time. So for example, you can apply cryo to enemies, use Venti's burst, Mona burst with Thrilling Tales, which will freeze enemies with extended Omen, and follow that up with Ganyu burst and charge shots to completely demolish everyone and everything that isn't a boss. Now Morgana actually has some variants too. So like I mentioned earlier with the freeze build, you don't actually need to use a shield because frozen enemies can't touch you. Instead of Diona, you can use Rosaria as another DPS or Shenhe to buff your Ganyu, and either team will work just fine. If you have Ayaka, she can also be in Diona's place for the strongest variant of the team because it'll just have so much damage. It's insane. It's really broken. If you don't have all the expensive units for Morgana though, you can still run freeze Ganyu. If you don't have Mona, you can use Kokomi instead, which gives you a regular freeze build, and here if you don't have Venti, you can use Kazuha or Sucrose. You will see a noticeable damage drop without Mona, and you won't be able to group enemies as well without Venti, but the team is still really good. Now I wouldn't suggest Xingqiu or Barbara, since Barbara needs you to be point blank with enemies to apply Hydro if she's not on the field dealing damage, and you don't really want her to be on the field when you have Ganyu. And Xingqiu's problem is he needs you to deal normal attack damage between shots, which can be a hassle to do, and Xingqiu is a unit that's usually occupied by Pyro DPS. So overall, I wouldn't suggest using those two, but Kokomi can be pretty valuable, and same with Kazuha and Sucrose. Now the one last team I want to talk about is a Copium support build for Ganyu. I hate it a lot. If you're forcing Ganyu to be a support, she has a couple comps that can work, but the main one I want to talk about is Melt Tao, where you're going to be using Hu Tao as a main DPS with Xingqiu, Diona, and Ganyu to help apply cryo and multiply Hu Tao's damage more. Overall, because of the inconsistency with Ganyu and Diona's cryo application, Hu Tao won't be able to melt every hit, and some Ganyu hits can make Hu Tao's reactions mess up in sequence, but if you're gonna make a Coco Goat support build, this is probably one of the better ways to do it. Ideally, if you're melting too, you are gonna get the buff from cryo resonance, which is pretty cool, but in general, I'm not a fan of this team, it just works. Another option is running Child main DPS with Blizzard Strayer and a freeze team, but I don't have enough team slots for that. So I know a lot of you guys are probably wondering about if C1 is worth it, and Ganyu's Constellations can be a massive increase in damage for her entire team when you have the right setup, so real quick, I want to go over them with you. First, her Constellation 1 decreases enemy cryo resistance by 15% when you hit an enemy with her charge shot. It gives Ganyu 2 energy back per level 2 charge shot, which is insane battery and freeze comps, and really good value if you're running an off-field cryo DPS, since they can both take advantage of the cryo resistance shred. Ganyu's Constellation 2 gives her an extra taunt charge, which has the same issue as Xiao Dash, where you can only really use it once per fight, but still it's a couple extra particles at the start. Now C2 doesn't actually get to be super good value until you have C6, but once you get there, it's crazy. Ganyu's Constellation 3 increases her burst level by 3. Her Constellation 4 increases enemy damage taken in her AoE by 5% every 3 seconds, up to a max of 25%. The reason it's damage taken instead of damage dealt to enemies is because Ganyu's burst snapshots buffs, which means that this Constellation would be useless if it wasn't set up to debuff enemies rather than buff Ganyu. This Constellation is another team damage increase, and the debuff lasts a total of 18 seconds since it'll linger for 3 seconds after the burst ends. Ganyu's Constellation 5 levels up Ganyu's skill by 3, and Constellation 6 is really good. It takes away the charge portion of your level 2 charge shot whenever you use her elemental skill. Now with C2, that means you can burst out 3 level 2 charge shots really quickly, which is useful for deleting bosses in seconds. That being said, it's locked behind C6, which I would never recommend for anyone to go for unless you have a lot of disposable income and choose to spend it that way. To be honest, Ganyu's Constellations are fairly solid, but you don't need any of them to make her functional. That being said though, if you're trying to choose between C1 and Amos bow, you should consider this. Amos bow is a weapon that can be used on many characters, but will cost you a lot of fates to guarantee, and is rollable on the standard banner. An R5 prototype crescent against enemies with weak spots is almost as good as R1 Amos bow, and an R5 Hamayumi is the same deal in melt. It's only about a 10% damage difference. Constellation 1 on Ganyu is a lot more restrictive since it's not something you can pass around to other characters, but her cryo resistance shred does increase overall team damage if you're using another cryo. It also helps with Ganyu's burst up time if you're in a freeze team, which can be pretty strong. That being said, with a free-to-play weapon and no Constellations, Ganyu is already insanely strong, and you don't need Constellations to make her good at all. If you're going to choose one, her Constellation 1 is easier to guarantee and will likely be a larger damage increase for your overall team than Amos, even though Amos is more flexible. In general, I wouldn't recommend going for either one, but if you're just looking for my opinion, I would argue Constellation 1 provides more value. So now let's talk about our closing thoughts. This video has been a wild ride. It's at 26 minutes now as of editing it, but it might be less than that by the time it goes out. Anyways, this section doesn't really need to be that long. We all know that Ganyu is ridiculously strong. As much as people like to argue she's not free-to-play friendly, some of her top weapons are accessible to free-to-play accounts without any gacha at all. And even if you don't have 5-star units to pair her with, her damage output is still insane. She's the best in the game at clearing trash mobs, makes your commissions take 2 minutes, and honestly just is kind of adorable. If you like the charge shot style, or if you're just looking for a bow carry DPS, Ganyu might be an excellent choice for you. But I do want to caution you that some people have complained about her gameplay being repetitive. And I'm not gonna lie, I can understand why people think that. It is the same gameplay over and over, and Ganyu kind of trivializes content. So if you make content too easy and you're doing the same thing over and over, it does become really repetitive and kind of unfun. But with that being said, everyone has different experiences with characters, and you as the player may find that you really enjoy Ganyu's gameplay loop. Now, if you want to know whether or not you should pull for Ganyu or Zhongli, I made a video on that a few days ago, so you should check that out. But I can say with confidence that Ganyu is one of the best units I've ever pulled, and she has definitely stood the test of time. Anyways, congrats on being a Ganyu or Chi-Chi haver, and I hope that this guide helped you out. Ganyu is one of my favorite units, and I hope she's one of yours too. This guide took a lot of effort to put together, so if you guys could leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, it would mean a ton. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.